Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
When my story became real. What if the story you are living right now is not the story you planned, but it is exactly the story that could change you? One ordinary morning in the United States, I opened my phone, saw a message from my husband, and suddenly felt something I could not explain. My family was safe. My children were laughing. My life looked normal. Yet I wondered, if nobody remembers my achievements, will my story still matter? I had no idea that by sunset, one small discovery would make me question everything I thought I knew about my own life. My name is Anna, and this is the story of how my ordinary American life became a story I finally wanted to live. That morning began with chaos, because apparently families do not believe in peaceful mornings. My daughter could not find her shoes. My son wanted pancakes while I answered a work email. My husband was searching for his keys while holding them in his hand. I laughed, but inside I felt tired. I was working, caring for children, managing a home, answering messages, and trying to keep everything moving. But somewhere between school drop-off and my first cup of coffee, I realized I had become a character in my own life instead of the person writing the story. I asked myself, what story am I telling through the way I live? Maybe you know that feeling. You are busy, but not fulfilled. You are moving forward, but you are not sure where you are going. You practice English, listen to videos, repeat sentences, and sometimes feel frustrated because progress seems painfully slow. I know that feeling too. So I began using my daily life as English practice. Instead of memorizing difficult words, I described simple moments. I am tired. I need a break. My family matters to me. I want to understand my life. Simple English felt easier when the words were connected to something real. That afternoon, I picked up my children from school. My daughter told me about a story she had written in class. I asked what it was about. She said, it is about a woman who thinks her story is boring, until she realizes she is the main character. I almost missed the red light because I was so surprised. Where did you get that idea? I asked. She shrugged. I just thought of it. Her words followed me home. That evening, I found an old box while looking for a family photo. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, and a small notebook from years ago. I opened it and found a sentence in my own handwriting. I want to build a life my children will remember. I stared at those words. Then I heard my husband calling from the hallway. Anna, you need to see this. His voice sounded serious. I closed the notebook and walked toward him, not knowing that what he was about to show me would change the next chapter of our family story. The life I almost ignored. My husband was standing beside the kitchen counter, holding an old photograph that I had completely forgotten about, and when I saw it, I suddenly understood why he had called my name so seriously. It was a picture of our family from a few years earlier, but something about it felt strange. We were smiling. The children were younger. My husband had his arm around me. Yet when I looked closely, I noticed that I was staring at the camera while everyone else was looking at each other. You were always there, my husband said, but sometimes you looked like you were somewhere else. His words were gentle, but they hurt because they were true. I had spent years believing that being present meant being physically in the room. I cooked dinner, helped with homework, drove to school, attended meetings, and sat beside my family on weekends. But my mind was often racing ahead. What should I do tomorrow? What email should I answer? What bill needed attention? What problem might appear next? My body was home, but my attention was constantly traveling. That night, I sat at the dining table and looked around our American home. Nothing looked dramatic. There were backpacks near the door, dishes waiting in the sink, children's drawings on the refrigerator, and a half-finished grocery list on the counter. Yet I suddenly saw these ordinary things differently. They were evidence of a life. My life. I remembered a simple English phrase I often teach through stories. I was there, but I wasn't present. Say it slowly. I was there, but I wasn't present. The sentence is simple, but the feeling behind it can be surprisingly deep. Research on attention and well-being suggests that constantly dividing our attention can make everyday experiences feel less satisfying. I did not need a scientific paper to convince me. My own kitchen was already providing the evidence. The next morning, I made one tiny experiment. When my children came downstairs, I put my phone away. I did not check messages during breakfast. I asked my son about his science project and actually listened to his entire answer, including the part about a plastic dinosaur that apparently played an important role. My daughter told me about a friend at school. I laughed. Then I noticed something unusual. Breakfast felt longer, even though it lasted the same amount of time. Nothing had changed except my attention. That afternoon, I decided to write down 3 moments that mattered to me. The first was my daughter laughing. The second was my husband making coffee for me without asking. The third was a quiet walk outside after work. None of these moments would appear on a resume. None would impress anyone at a business meeting. Yet together, they made me feel strangely grateful. I began wondering whether I had been searching for a bigger life when I actually needed to notice the life I already had. But just when I thought I was beginning to understand my story, my husband came home earlier than usual, placed his phone on the table, and said, "We need to talk about something I found." His expression told me this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. The story my husband saw. My husband sat across from me and placed a small envelope on the table. I recognized it immediately. It contained an old letter I had written to myself when our marriage was still young. I had completely forgotten about it. "I found this while cleaning the closet," he said. "I read the first line, and I thought you should see it again." I opened the envelope carefully. The handwriting was mine, but the woman behind those words felt almost like a stranger. I had written, "I hope we never become too busy to notice each other." I stared at the sentence for a long time. My husband did not say anything. He did not need to. We both knew that somewhere along the way, we had become exactly what my younger self had feared. We still loved each other, but our conversations had slowly become practical. "Did you pick up the kids? Can you pay this bill? What time is your meeting?" Who is cooking tonight? We communicated, but we did not always connect. That distinction suddenly felt enormous. I looked at him and asked, "Do you think we changed?" He smiled sadly. I think life changed, and we changed with it. There was no blame in his voice, and somehow that made the conversation more powerful. Marriage is not only about staying together during dramatic moments. Much of marriage happens in tiny, repetitive moments when two people either continue noticing each other or slowly become background noise. Relationship research often emphasizes communication, responsiveness, and shared experiences as important parts of maintaining connection over time. I realized we had been treating love like a house that would maintain itself simply because we had built it years ago. Unfortunately, love is not a houseplant. You cannot water it once and expect it to survive forever. That night, we decided to try something simple. Every evening, for 15 minutes, we would talk without phones. No television. No chores. No multitasking. Just 15 minutes. For English practice, here is a natural phrase. I miss the way we used to talk. Say it slowly. I miss the way we used to talk. Another useful sentence is, I want us to feel close again. These are simple expressions, but they can open difficult conversations in real relationships. Our first 15-minute conversation was awkward. We sat on the couch like two strangers waiting for a job interview. Then my husband laughed. This is weird. I laughed too. Very romantic. But after a few minutes, we started talking. We remembered our first apartment, our favorite restaurant, the ridiculous vacation where we got lost for 3 hours. And the first time our daughter called us Mommy and Daddy. We laughed until our faces hurt. Then the mood changed. My husband looked at me and asked, "When did you stop telling me what you were afraid of?" I looked down at my hands. That question was different. I could have answered with something easy. Instead, I told him the truth. I was afraid that I was becoming someone I did not recognize. I was afraid my children would remember me as busy instead of loving. And I was afraid our marriage would become a story where two people stayed together but stopped truly seeing each other. My husband reached for my hand. Then maybe, he said quietly, we should write a different chapter. I wanted to believe him. But the next morning, an unexpected problem at home tested whether our new promise could survive real life. When our marriage felt different. The next morning began with the kind of problem that can turn a peaceful family into a tiny emergency department before breakfast. Our youngest woke up upset, my daughter could not find her school project, and I had an important work meeting in less than an hour. Normally, I would have handled everything myself while quietly becoming irritated at everyone. That was my old pattern. If something went wrong, I moved faster. If I felt overwhelmed, I became quieter. If my husband offered help, I sometimes said, I've got it, even when I absolutely did not have it. But that morning, I remembered our conversation from the night before. I looked at him and said, I need help. It was only 3 words, but they felt strangely difficult to say. He immediately got up. What do you need? I told him. He took the children to search for the missing project while I prepared for work. 10 minutes later, my daughter found it underneath the couch. Apparently, the safest place for a school project was the exact location where nobody would ever look. We laughed, and the morning continued. Nothing was perfect, but something had changed. I had stopped treating my husband like someone who needed to guess what I needed. I had started communicating. In relationships, clear communication can reduce misunderstanding because people cannot reliably read each other's minds. I used to expect my husband to notice when I was tired, frustrated, or worried. When he did not, I sometimes felt unloved. Now I understood something simple. Silence can create stories that are not true. For English practice, listen to this sentence. I need your help. Say it slowly. I need your help. Another useful sentence is, can we talk about this? These are simple American English phrases, but they can change the direction of a difficult conversation. That evening, my husband and I kept our 15-minute promise. He asked me how my day had been. I told him about my meeting, but then I added something I had never said clearly before. I feel like I have been trying to prove that I can do everything. He looked at me and said, "You never had to prove that to me." I felt tears coming. I know that now. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. I think I have been doing the same thing. I looked at him. He explained that he had been trying to be the strong one too. He worked hard because he wanted to protect our family. He stayed quiet about his stress because he did not want to add more pressure to me. Suddenly, we saw the problem differently. We were both trying to protect each other, but our protection had created distance. We were carrying invisible backpacks and pretending they were empty. That night, we decided to make one more change. Every Sunday, we would sit together and talk honestly about the week ahead. Not just schedules. Feelings too. What worried us? What excited us? What did we need? What did we want to protect? It sounded simple, almost too simple. But simple things can be powerful when people actually do them. Over the next few weeks, our marriage began to feel different. We laughed more. We argued less about small things. We listened better. But then our daughter came home from school one afternoon with tears in her eyes. And what she told me made me realize our family story was about to enter a much harder chapter. My children changed the plot. My daughter came home from school holding her backpack tightly against her chest, and I knew something was wrong before she said a word. She usually entered the house like a small hurricane, talking about everything at once. That afternoon, she quietly took off her shoes and sat on the stairs. I sat beside her and asked, "What happened?" She looked at me and said, "I think you and Dad are always busy." Her words stopped me. I wanted to explain that we were working hard for the family, that adults had responsibilities, that life was complicated. But I remembered something important. Listening does not mean preparing your defense while the other person is talking. So I stayed quiet. She continued, "Sometimes I want to tell you something, but you are looking at your phone." I felt a familiar sting of guilt, but this time I did not run from it. I asked, "What do you want me to know?" She told me about a school presentation she was nervous about. She had wanted to practice with me, but she had decided not to ask because I looked tired. That sentence broke my heart more than any criticism could have. I realized children notice much more than adults think. They may not understand our deadlines or bills, but they understand attention. They know when someone is listening. They know when someone is physically present but mentally somewhere else. I hugged her and said, "I'm sorry. I want you to ask me again." She smiled a little. "Can we practice now?" Of course. We sat at the kitchen table, and she practiced her presentation 3 times. The first time, she was nervous. The second time, she forgot a sentence. The third time, she stood taller. I watched her and thought about my own English learning. Learning a language can feel similar. You listen. You make mistakes. You forget words. You try again. You become a little more confident. For English practice, try this sentence. It is okay to make mistakes. Say it slowly. It is okay to make mistakes. Another useful phrase is, try again. Simple words can give someone courage. That evening, I told my husband what had happened. He looked thoughtful. "Maybe the kids are teaching us too," he said. I smiled. He was right. We had been trying to create a better family life by solving adult problems, while our children were quietly showing us what mattered most: attention, patience, and presence. We decided to create a weekly family night. No phones. No work. No complicated plans. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we played board games. Sometimes we simply watched the sunset from the backyard. One Friday, we ordered pizza and let the children choose the movie. My son chose something so ridiculous that my husband and I exchanged a look of parental surrender. But halfway through, everyone was laughing. I looked around the room and realized something surprising. Our family story was changing, not because we had solved every problem, but because we were paying attention to each other again. Still, there was one thing I had not told my husband. I had been carrying a private fear about my own future, a fear that had nothing to do with our children or our marriage. And one evening, after everyone went to bed, I finally decided it was time to tell him. I knew the truth could either bring us closer or change everything. The day I stopped pretending. The house was finally quiet, but my mind was louder than ever. I sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, waiting for my husband to come downstairs. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say at least 10 times, and somehow every version sounded either too dramatic or not honest enough. When he finally sat beside me, he looked at my face and asked, "What is it?" I took a breath and said, "I am afraid I am losing myself." He did not interrupt. So I continued. I told him that I loved our family, but sometimes I felt invisible inside my own routine. I was afraid that one day the children would grow up, the house would become quiet, and I would suddenly realize I had spent years taking care of everyone except myself. I admitted that I sometimes wanted to write, learn, create, and explore new things. But I felt guilty whenever I thought about doing something just for me. My husband listened carefully. Then he asked, "Why did you think you had to hide that from me?" I looked down. "Because I thought you might think I was unhappy with our life." He shook his head. "Wanting something more does not mean you love what you already have less." Those words hit me harder than I expected. I had been treating love like a limited resource, as if giving attention to myself would somehow take love away from my family. But healthy relationships need room for individual growth too. People can love their families deeply and still have personal dreams, interests, and goals. For English practice, listen to this sentence: I love my family, and I also want to grow. Say it slowly. I love my family, and I also want to grow. Another useful phrase is, I need some time for myself. These are simple, natural sentences that can help English learners talk about boundaries and personal needs. My husband reached across the table and held my hand. "Then let's make room for that," he said. I asked, "You are not upset?" He smiled. "I would be more upset if you spent years pretending everything was fine." I laughed through my tears. That conversation changed something between us. I stopped pretending that being strong meant never needing help. I stopped believing that being a good mother meant disappearing completely into motherhood. And I stopped thinking my personal dreams were selfish simply because I had a family. We made a small plan. 3 evenings a week, I would have 1 quiet hour for myself. I could read, write, practice English, walk outside, or simply sit without doing anything productive. At first, I felt guilty. Then I noticed something surprising. When I gave myself permission to rest and grow, I became more patient with everyone else. My husband noticed too. "You laugh more now," he said one evening. I smiled. Maybe because I finally have enough space to hear myself think. For the first time, my story felt like mine again. But just as I began to feel hopeful, an unexpected phone call arrived. It was about an opportunity one had dreamed about for years. The timing was terrible, the decision was complicated, and accepting it could force our family to make a choice none of us was prepared for. A new chapter for us. The opportunity sounded exciting, but the timing was almost comically terrible. I had barely started enjoying my quiet hour when my phone rang with an offer to join a small creative project in my city. It was something I had wanted for a long time, writing simple stories and helping people practice English through everyday American life. My first reaction was excitement. My second reaction was panic. My third reaction was, naturally, maybe I should pretend I never saw the email. That evening, I told my husband. I expected hesitation, but he simply asked, "Do you want to do it?" I nodded. "Then we should find a way." His answer sounded simple, but I knew finding a way would not be simple. We had children, work, school schedules, meals, homework, and approximately 17,000 tiny tasks that somehow appeared every week. Still, we decided not to ask, "Can I do this?" We asked, "How can we make this work?" That small change in language changed the entire conversation. Instead of seeing my dream as a problem, we treated it as a family decision. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about schedules. My husband offered to handle school pickup on 2 evenings. I would prepare dinner earlier on those days. The children could help with simple chores. Nobody was thrilled about every part of the plan, but everyone had a role. It reminded me that strong families are not built by one person carrying everything. They are built by people sharing responsibility. For English learners, this is a useful phrase. How can we make this work? Say it slowly. How can we make this work? It is practical, natural American English, especially when solving problems together. Another phrase is, let's figure it out together. I loved that sentence because it described exactly what our family was learning to do. My first week was messy. One evening, I forgot an important meeting because my son needed help with homework. Another night, dinner was so late that everyone was eating cereal at nearly 9 o'clock. My husband looked at the table and said, "Well, at least we have breakfast for dinner." We laughed. The old me might have called the week a failure. The new me called it practice. I was learning that a meaningful life does not become meaningful because everything works perfectly. It becomes meaningful because you keep adjusting, communicating, and choosing what matters. Slowly, my project began to grow. I wrote short English stories about family dinners, American neighborhoods, rainy afternoons, school mornings, and ordinary moments that people often ignore. I noticed something beautiful. The simpler the story, the easier it was for learners to understand. A sentence like "I was tired, but I kept going" could carry more emotion than a complicated paragraph. That became my favorite lesson. You do not need difficult English to tell a powerful story. You need honest words. At home, our conversations became more honest too. My husband started sharing his worries before they became problems. The children became more comfortable telling us when something bothered them. We were not a perfect family. We were simply becoming a more truthful one. Then, one Saturday morning, my husband handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note from our children. I opened it and read one sentence that made my heart stop. "Mom, we like your new story." I smiled, but I had no idea those words would lead to the biggest emotional test our family had faced in years. When love found its meaning. The note from my children stayed on our refrigerator for weeks. It was only one sentence, but every time I saw it, I felt a quiet warmth in my chest. "Mom, we like your new story." I used to think a good family story needed a dramatic ending, something big enough to remember forever. Instead, I was learning that love often hides inside ordinary days. One Saturday morning, my husband and I took the children to a local park in our city. The weather was warm, people were walking their dogs, children were riding bicycles. And someone nearby was playing music far too loudly for a peaceful afternoon. My husband looked at me and laughed. "This is our glamorous life." I laughed too. It was not glamorous, but it was ours. We sat on a bench while the children played. My husband reached for my hand and said, "Do you remember when you were afraid that we had lost our connection?" I nodded. "I still remember." He smiled. "I think we were not lost. We were just distracted." That sentence stayed with me. Sometimes relationships do not break because people stop loving each other. Sometimes they become distant because life becomes noisy. Work becomes urgent. Phones become irresistible. Children need attention. Bills arrive with impressive confidence. And two people who once talked for hours suddenly talk mostly about schedules. The good news is that connection can be rebuilt through small, repeated choices. We had learned that firsthand. For English practice, here is a useful sentence. We were not lost. We were just distracted. Say it slowly. We were not lost. We were just distracted. Another natural phrase is, love needs attention too. Simple English can express deep ideas when the words are connected to real experiences. That afternoon, my daughter ran toward us holding a small flower. She gave it to me and said, "This is for your story." I asked, "Why?" She shrugged. "Because you look happy now." I looked at my husband. He smiled. I suddenly realized that my children were not measuring our happiness by the size of our house, the money we earned, or the number of things we owned. They were watching how we treated each other. They were learning what love looked like by watching us communicate, apologize, laugh, and make time for one another. That realization changed my definition of success. I no longer wanted to build a life that looked impressive from the outside. I wanted to build a life that felt honest from the inside. That did not mean every day became peaceful. We still argued. We still got tired. Sometimes my husband forgot something important, and sometimes I became impatient over something ridiculous. Like the dishwasher being loaded incorrectly. Apparently, there are several ways to load a dishwasher, and marriage is occasionally a conference about all of them. But our disagreements no longer frightened me. We knew how to return to the conversation. We knew how to say, "I'm sorry." We knew how to say, "I understand." Most importantly, we knew how to say, "Let's try again." One evening, after the children were asleep, I opened my notebook and wrote a sentence. My story matters because I am still writing it. I felt peaceful for the first time in a long while. Then I received a message that made my heart race. It was from someone connected to my new project, and the message contained an unexpected question. Would you be willing to share your story with a much larger audience? I stared at the screen. Suddenly, our private family journey was about to become something much bigger. Why our story matters. The message stayed on my phone for several minutes before I answered. A larger audience? My first instinct was to say no. Sharing simple English stories felt safe when they were small, quiet, and personal. But telling people about my family, my marriage, my fears, and the changes we had made felt completely different. I asked my husband what he thought. He read the message and looked at me. Are you afraid people will judge you? I nodded. Then maybe that is exactly why your story matters. His answer surprised me. I had always imagined courage as something dramatic. I thought brave people stood on stages without fear, made huge decisions, and never doubted themselves. But perhaps courage was much quieter. Maybe courage was simply telling the truth while your voice was still shaking. I decided to say yes. The first recording was harder than I expected. I sat in a quiet room with a microphone and tried to speak slowly and clearly. Suddenly, every simple English sentence felt complicated. My brain became a tiny emergency manager. What if I make a mistake? What if people do not understand? What if my accent sounds different? What if nobody cares? Then I remembered something I had learned while practicing English. Communication does not require perfection. It requires connection. So I started again. My name is Anna. This is my story. The sentence was simple. But it felt powerful because it was true. For English learners, try saying it with me. This is my story. Slowly, this is my story. You do not need advanced vocabulary to tell people who you are. You can begin with simple sentences. I was afraid. I made a mistake. I learned something. I tried again. These small sentences can become a powerful story when they are honest. As I continued recording, I thought about the people who might be listening. Maybe someone was learning English after a long day at work. Maybe someone was embarrassed by their mistakes. Maybe someone had stopped practicing because progress felt too slow. I wanted them to know something I had finally understood. You do not have to become perfect before your story becomes valuable. My husband walked into the room while I was recording. He listened for a moment and smiled. You sound like yourself, he said. That became the best compliment I could have received. Not perfect. Not impressive. Just myself. Later that evening, the children listened to the recording. My daughter said, Mom, your English sounds calm. I laughed. That is because I am sitting down. She laughed too. But her comment made me think about how learning can become easier when we stop treating every mistake like an emergency. Slow English gives the brain time to process sound, meaning, rhythm, and context. It gives learners permission to listen carefully instead of rushing. I realized my story was becoming more than a story about marriage or family. It was also a story about learning to be patient with myself. The larger audience eventually came, and so did unexpected messages from people who said the story reminded them of their own lives. Some were learning English. Some were struggling with relationships. Some simply needed to hear that ordinary life could still have meaning. I read those messages late one night and felt tears in my eyes. Then my husband came into the room and asked, "Are you okay?" I smiled and said, "I think I finally understand why our story matters." But the final lesson was still waiting for me, and it came from the person who had been watching everything from the beginning, my daughter. The story I choose to live. My daughter stood in the doorway holding the same little notebook she had used for her school story, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She walked over, placed it on the table, and said, "Mom, I changed the ending." I smiled and opened the notebook. Her new ending was simple. The woman stopped trying to make her life perfect. She started making it meaningful. I read the sentence twice. Then I looked at my daughter, and suddenly the entire journey came back to me. The busy mornings. The old photograph. The conversation with my husband. The fear I had hidden. The family nights. The small English stories. The mistakes. The laughter. None of those moments had looked important when they happened. Together, they had become the story of my life. I used to believe that a meaningful life required a dramatic transformation. Now I understand that meaning is often built quietly. It can live in a husband making coffee before you wake up. It can live in a child asking you to listen. It can live in saying, "I need help," instead of pretending you are fine. It can live in learning one English sentence today and repeating it again tomorrow. It can live in choosing to apologize, choosing to listen, and choosing to stay connected when life becomes difficult. For English practice, remember this simple sentence: my story is still being written. Say it slowly. My story is still being written. Another sentence is even simpler: my story matters. These words are easy, but they carry something powerful. Your English does not have to be perfect before you speak. Your life does not have to be perfect before you appreciate it. And your family does not have to be perfect before you love it deeply. In the months that followed, our family kept changing. My children grew more independent. My husband and I continued our weekly conversations. We still had stressful days. We still disagreed. We still occasionally argued about the dishwasher, which apparently remains one of civilization's greatest unsolved mysteries. But we had learned something important: happiness is not the absence of problems. Sometimes happiness is knowing that when problems arrive, you do not have to face them alone. My English storytelling project also continued. I kept writing simple stories about ordinary American life, family dinners, relationships, personal growth, and the little moments that make a day memorable. And every time someone told me, "Your story helped me practice English," I remembered where it began, at a kitchen table, with an old photograph and one uncomfortable question. What story am I telling through the way I live? Today, I still ask myself that question. Not because I am afraid of giving the wrong answer, but because it reminds me to pay attention. If you are learning English and feel discouraged, remember this: you do not need to understand every word today. Listen again. Read slowly. Repeat one sentence. Speak even when your voice is imperfect. Progress is often quiet before it becomes visible. And if your life feels ordinary right now, do not underestimate it. Ordinary days become memories. Small choices become habits. Habits become character. And character becomes the story people remember. My story did not become meaningful because everything went perfectly. It became meaningful when I stopped waiting for a perfect life and started fully living the life I already had. So if you are wondering whether your story matters, my answer is simple: yes. Your story matters because you are still here, still learning, still loving, still changing, and still writing the next sentence. And sometimes, the most beautiful chapter begins exactly when you think the story is over. That is all for today. I'll make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to watch them.